So, will Reverend Barber make some opening remarks? Or I think I would like him to make an opening, to offer an opening thought for this discussion. I'd be very grateful if he did that.
Thank you, my brother. I was thinking of three. I remember reading a quote somewhere where your grandfather, Mahatma Gandhi, said about Christians that he didn't really have a problem with Jesus. It was some of the Christians that he kept meeting, or at least those that were using the name. My greatest prayer today is that if he were to meet me and those of us that are people of faith in this Poor People's Campaign, that he would not be disappointed, that he would find that somebody does believe and still believes and will always believe in the way of love and truth and justice and nonviolence. As my dear sister was talking, I was thinking about India, America. Here we are together today talking about justice. There's a scripture in the Bible that says, I think it's Psalm 133, how good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters dwell together in unity. And then it goes on to describe it being like the morning dew and like being anointed as you would anoint a king, actually, interestingly enough. But it's this sense of there's something great about it. There's something holy about unity, particularly unity, not to be a mob, but unity to be a movement for justice. And then lastly, my morning scripture that I read every morning, because in some ways it connects me with all of the religions of the world, because it does not talk specifically about one historical figure, i.e. Jesus, but it talks about the Spirit. And we all have a relationship when we talk about the Spirit of God, if you will. Every religion has some concept of the Spirit of the divine. And in my tradition, it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for the Spirit has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, deliverance to the captive, to set at liberty those who have been bruised. And then it says, and to declare that this is the year of the Lord to act. In other words, to declare the acceptable year of the Lord. In other words, the year in which God says, I'm tired of all the division. Everybody is welcome. I'm going to put that witness in the earth again and again and again and again. So with all of that, I'm just so honored and humbled to be able to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Now, as I think Sunita mentioned, apart from being one of his grandsons, I'm also a biographer of the old man. I've lived with him as a scholar, as a researcher also for a long, long time. In fact, I'm now older than Gandhi was when he was killed.
Wow.
That is a curious sensation. But there is something I wanted to mention to you. In the year 1936, that is 84 years ago, Howard Thurman, this amazing man, theologian, philosopher, he was then dean of Rankin Chapel at Howard University, and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and their friends, Edward and Finola Carroll. They met Gandhi in the Western Indian town of Bardoli, 1936. And Gandhi had a wonderful companion secretary, a man called Mahadev Desai, who was with him for 19 years by this time, from 1917 onwards. And he says that Gandhi was more excited about meeting this delegation of African-American figures than he had been for any other meeting until that point. He was absolutely excited. And then they met for 3 hours. 3 hours. We're talking about 1936. And Gandhi asked Reverend Thurman detailed questions about slavery. Was intermarriage by this time between whites and African Americans legal? Was it being allowed? And Sue Bailey Thurman spoke about lynching. They had a very serious discussion. And at the end of 3 hours of conversation about the situation in the United States at that time and about the situation of India, which was still struggling for independence, it was struggling for Hindu-Muslim friendship, it was struggling for some equality for the Dalits, the untouchables of India. At the end of that 3-hour conversation, Gandhi said, and this was recorded at the time, both in India, and then when Howard Thurman returned to the US, he recorded it in the United States. Gandhi said, well, it may be the African Americans will teach nonviolence to the whole world.
Wow.
1936. So this is what he said then. And this earlier this year when the Black Lives Matter thing happened and so much of America was out on the streets in a disciplined way, in a non-violent way, fighting for equality, fighting for solidarity. I said to myself, once again, Gandhi's incredible prophecy all of the African Americans was being fulfilled. So I wanted to relate this story to you as a prelude, as the beginning of our conversation. And then, yeah, I mean,
it's powerful. I've read the piece called "The Conversation."
Yeah.
How Thurman and met Gandhi and
okay.
Violence. It was 15 years also before he mentored Dr. King.
Well, of course, yes.
Excuse me?
Well, Dr. King never met Gandhi.
That's right. It was 15 years. He met him through Howard Thurman.
Exactly.
15 years. So in some sense, Howard Thurman was so moved by that conversation, embodied that conversation, taught it to Dr. King 15 years later.
Okay.
And I've read that book. And I'll give you an interesting anecdotal story.
Please.
When the Charleston riots happened at the beginning, just before the inauguration of Trump, and the burnings and the statue and the young lady was killed, a car running through the crowd, I was invited to come to Charlottesville, to preach to an integrated congregation about maybe a week or so after everything had occurred. Now, when I arrived, it had police everywhere. We had to have deep security for a nonviolent gathering. They had to have everybody check for guns. There was a van parked across from the church that was very suspicious, and the police got called in. And finally, we got inside after all of that, and I was scheduled to preach that night. And I preached about this call to love and call to justice. And then I had to preach the next morning at Rankin Chapel at Howard University. Well, now it's not Rankin because they actually use the auditorium, but it's the chapel, the same chapel service that Howard Thurman would have presided over. And I didn't have a robe.
Okay.
They went in the back, and the only robe that fit me was Howard Thurman's robe.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
And the dean came out and said, would you wear this robe? And I said, whose robe is it? And he said, it's Howard Thurman's robe. I said, you all keep Howard Thurman? He said, that's one of the robes that we keep here, and try it on. And it fit snugly. And I've never forgotten that day, that after coming out of a place with so much vitriol and violence, Charlottesville, and preaching in that place, and coming to Howard University, doing the morning service, and the only robe that would fit me, my own robes would not fit me. I didn't have a robe, and nothing else they had there but the robe of Howard Thurman. And I'm yet trying to unpack spiritually what all of that means and has meant for men.
Well, I think it means that somebody's mantle is on somebody's shoulders.
My
Yes, that, I'm afraid that is what it means. I'm sorry, you cannot run away from that, sir. You cannot. No. And I think that's a wonderful recollection you are sharing. And so allow me now to say this. As Sunita, who introduced the two of us to each other and to everybody else, mentioned, India, with 1.3 billion people,
Mm-hmm.
which has tried to be a democracy for all these years after independence in 1947, almost 70 years or more. So this country now is facing a very serious assault on our democracy and some kind of uh, destruction of democratic rights, of human rights, of the notion of equality. Not yet a attempt to change the constitution, but an informal imposition of inequality, especially directed at the Muslims and the Christians who are a minority in India, and at the Dalits, the former untouchables who are at the bottom of Indian society. So what is happening now is so serious, and the situation, Reverend Barber, is this, that America has such immense challenges internally that it's not easy every day for the American citizen to understand what is happening in this important country called India.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And since, and I want to make the most important point I want to make right away. Now that you've mentioned this incredible story of Howard Thurman and the robe. If, as you say, as Howard Thurman said, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, as Reverend James Lawson said to me just a few days ago,
Mm-hmm.
that Gandhi gave something inspiring and useful to the African Americans at an important time in their life. I now make a request and appeal to you. Please do something for India now in return. Please, the African American community and all of America. Yes, America has immense challenges, and American society has shown how it is meeting those challenges too in recent months, as we saw after the George Floyd murder. But now I plead with you, and through you, I plead with the African Americans of the United States and with all Americans, with the Poor People's Program and with everybody else. Please, the United States must take on board the situation in a country like India for the sake of humanity, and raise your voices in defense of Gandhi's values, in defense of universal values, in defense of the values that we hold dear. So I want you to reflect on this, Reverend Barber, and we want to, and whenever you want, Sunita and Raju and the rest of us will give you details of what is happening in state after state in India today, and how people are being arrested without due process, how they're being detained without trial, how they're being detained without charges being brought, and how a whole propaganda is being unleashed to enable the actual end of democratic rights in India. So I wanted to right away bring, yeah.
Well, may I for a moment say that, first of all, I want to accept that challenge, and because we are in a moment in the world, what you see happening here, what you see happening in India, this battle versus of human rights versus authoritarianism, in some ways neo-fascism, attempts of people to decide in raw, over and over again, nationalism and the destruction of those, particularly at the bottom. I think it's time now for that 3-hour conversation to come this way. And I make a commitment to you today that we're going to have that, even if we have to have it like this. Just like Howard Thurman went to India, we need that delegation in a very open way. We need to write about it chronically, coming and telling. The first goal of always of moving towards speaking out in truth is to get the truth. And sometimes with the way in which the media is focused like a laser on just what's in this country, we do not hear these larger truths, but we must hear these larger truths, and we must connect it to the rest of the world. I was thinking, as you were saying, one of the reasons we have to have that conversation as well is because you said 70 years trying to be a democracy. America's over 200 years trying to be a democracy. Mm-hmm. And I immediately took that number 70 and added it to 1776, that America claims its kind of birthday. And I got 1846. Well, what was happening in America in 1846, 70 years after its so-called founding? We were right in the height of the Civil War. Now, when I say that, people are going to correct me. They're going to say, no, the Civil War started in 1861. No, there was a civil war in the church in the 1840s. Mm-hmm. The churches split first. When religious leaders decided either they were pro-slavery or they were not, that they were going to be on the side of inhumanity or they were going to be on the side of humanity. They were going to be on the side of violating people's rights, or whether they were going to be on the side of freedom and justice. And they made a decision, and there was a civil war in 1846 and beyond, right down the heart of the church, right down the heart of the moral voices, what should have been the very voices challenging the system of slavery. And you ended up with Northern Methodists and Southern Methodists and Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists and Northern Presbyterian and Southern Presbyterian. And even some of our greatest universities, if you go into the stacks, you will find where treatises were written at places like Harvard and other places that actually, and many schools that have great legacies in some ways, but they had professors on those staff that were, or faculties that were making the case for slavery. They were making it biologically, they were making it theologically. They were arguing that it was the way of economics. It was the way it had to be. You know, when we started out here in America and other places, economics was not a study. It was moral philosophy. Mm-hmm. Then they separated economics from moral considerations, because you really can't have a lot of moral consideration if the fundamental basis of your economic system is going to be slavery. And so you had this split. And I would suspect that you're having the same kinds of things happening in India, where the very voices, the very religious voices, if you will, moral voices, end up choosing sides. And many times, too many of them choose the side of authoritarianism or the side of rugged, raw nationalism. And then, and there was this split. So, but it was 70 years of trying to be a democracy. And what did America also do that's very similar to this 70th year for India? America tried to build a democracy on an internal caste system to some degree. Mm-hmm. Yes. Because, see, it was in 1619 with Bacon, in the 1600s, it was at Bacon's Rebellion that there was a decision to decide certain people were Black. Race was not a category, but there was a deliberate decision, and it grew out of when Black and white people formed a coalition to fight against injustice, to fight against some people who were trying to rule their lives. And the power structure said, we can't have this anymore, so we're going to make certain people Black, and we're going to make a caste system called slavery, and that is, how you're born is how you live. If you're born a slave, you're always a slave. And it was this caste system that was that never really was dealt with when the democracy decided to call itself a democracy. So all of its founding words, and as Dr. King used to say, we have the high blood pressure of creeds and the anemia of deeds. And all of this, the high founding where we the people, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It was built on top of this caste system of slavery. Yes. So 70 years afterwards, inevitably there was going to be a struggle, right, with what the democracy would be, because the words of the democracy, just like the words of the Constitution of India, the Democratic Constitution of India, says one thing and calls for one thing. The legacy of Mahatma Gandhi calls for one thing, but it's built on top of this system of caste, this system of untouchables, and so so we need to have that conversation, because in some ways, India in her 70th year or plus is in a very similar place, not exactly, not identical, but in a very similar place, some similarity than America was in her 70th year. And it took a war to get it, and we still haven't gotten it right, totally.
So I'm very glad to discover also, Reverend Barber, that you're a historian, among other things. And here, allow me to mention one or two other aspects of the Gandhi-Thurman meeting of 1936. Now, as you know, Gandhi was convinced, he felt very deeply that India would embrace equality, embrace nonviolence, embrace love. India would be a nation for all. And it would fight for its freedom. But in 1934, a year and a half before the Thurman-Gandhi meeting, two things happened. There were two attempts on Gandhi's life by representatives of the higher caste Hindus. They were angry with him for two reasons. That he wanted equality for Muslims along with Hindus. They didn't like that. And he wanted the hierarchy, the high and low in Hindu society to end. So there were two attempts on Gandhi's life. And Gandhi also saw there was a pushback against the idea of everybody being equal and getting equal rights. And so to some extent, Gandhi kind of saw that for India to embrace equality and non-violence, non-exploitation, non-hierarchy was going to be a very tough challenge. And then he meets Howard Thurman. And for 3 hours, he hears him and the others. And they also sang some spirituals to him. And they speak of the history of their fight against slavery. And then Gandhi has this insight that there is, in the African-American spirit, the community, there is sacrifice, there is suffering, there is love of God, there is reaching out, there is searching. And Gandhi gets this inspiration, which he shares, that the African Americans may be the leaders of the world in this new revolution. So,
and that was in that meeting. And when I hear you say that, what it makes me think about is why maybe Thurman was so insistent on going to see Gandhi.
Yes.
And why Mahatma Gandhi was so drawn to Thurman from the standpoint of the two groups of people in this history. And what I mean by that is, if Gandhi was talking about love and bringing together the Muslim and the Hindu and justice and humanity, even before the civil rights movement, the basis of the struggle for freedom in this country by African Americans had primarily been nonviolent, even in slavery. You know, Harriet Tubman stole slaves. She didn't kill slave masters. Now, there was a war. There was violence. That was a war, and that was a war primarily not caused by Black people, but caused by the state, because the state had a war, as I said, in the church, and then a war in the country. And that war, when Abraham Lincoln first fought it, wasn't even over for so much the slaves. It was more about saving the Union. It was Frederick Douglass and others who said, you have to make this about the freedom of our people. But there is a tradition that also should speak to the Hindu people now as well. And that is what happened after the Civil War, the Reconstruction movement. And maybe some of that is the reason why Howard Thurman, because he knew that movement. He knew that movement. W.B. Du Bois had written about that movement. And the Reconstruction movement post the Civil War was when former slaves and free issue blacks and poor white people, many of them who had been taught to hate black people, but during the Civil War, they came to see that ultimately injustice and slavery and authoritarianism would kill us all. And first would always kill the poorest, because the slaveholders used the poorest whites to fight the war, right? And they actually made laws that said if a slave master had so many slaves, his son didn't have to go to war. After the Civil War in the South, and this is a movement that's not often discussed, but it would be one of the places, if I had this conversation, we had a conversation, gathered some people, talking to people in India about now and about the connection. Black, former slaves, free issue, and poor whites. They came together and they founded something called fusion politics.
Mm-hmm.
They came from different places, but they had a vision of what had to happen so that the nation could move forward. So if you will, the nation could have another birth, another founding. And they basically decided that freedom wasn't enough. You had to have full citizenship. And that full citizenship needed to be rooted in our deepest moral values, our deepest spiritual values, and that had to drive how we would reshape our constitutional values. And so they came together in 1865, and inside of 4 years, a lot of people don't know this history, you probably would, inside of 4 years, Black people and whites who were formerly enemies but came together around a fusion understanding had transformed every southern state government, had passed the 13th Amendment, anti-slavery, had passed the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, that also ended up protecting white women and so forth and so on. That they passed by 1870, the Voting Rights Act of 1970. And they decided that there were some fundamental things that you had to do to break this former caste system of slavery that had caused the Civil War and the residue of it. Number one, you had to guarantee everybody education. And so in those southern states, they made education a constitutional right.
Mm-hmm.
They said everybody didn't have to have the right to vote. Now, they didn't go far enough because they didn't include women until 1920, but they did take away a part of the residue from the original Constitution that said only men that own land could vote.
Mm-hmm.
Only white men that own land. They said, and they passed voting rights laws. And then in 1875, and they had resistance, but they took it on non-violently. 1865 all the way to 1896, they took it on non-violently, and they passed the 1875 Civil Rights Act that made it a felony to engage in racism in the 1800s, which is why Dr. King his opening words at the Lincoln Monument was so sad when he said 50 years ago, but 100 years later. He was basically saying, we dealt with this. Yeah. We should have. Now, there was, Brother Gandhi, a violent reaction. If you know, the Klan was formed in 1872, primarily to first scare white people away from having these moral, spiritual, fusion, political, economic relationships with former slaves and free issue Black. And then there was an attack on voting rights. And then there was an attack to defund the government so that the government could not help the poorest and the least of these who had been ravaged both by slavery and by the Civil War. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because that tradition, that moral fusion tradition, I continue to believe that what has to happen even today in America And when I hear you mention what's going on in India, what has to happen in India, and what has to happen in every democracy that ever has been founded, but it didn't clean up some things at the very beginning, and that is reconstruction. A democracy must go through every so many years, and reconstruction is not just new laws, it is bringing in the people who haven't been included. It's not just making a new law like the New Deal with Roosevelt. It's literally changing the power structure and undermining and tearing apart all of the castes, whether it's political castes, economic castes, social, all of the ways in which we have said, you all belong over there. You can't really be a part of the leadership of this country. We'll do it over here. And every reconstruction, whether it's the reconstruction in the 1800s or the civil rights movement, which was a reconstruction, I believe America is facing a third reconstruction right now. And in some ways, India may be, in this 70th year, going into a kind of first reconstruction of some sort post the beginning of democracy in the 1840s.
Fantastic. And I have two wishes. These are dreams. And one of these dreams is I want to make a clone of Reverend Barber and take him to India. And my second wish or dream is to make myself younger and go with you to India. But let me say this, that what you have said is so immediately relevant to India. These two ideas of fusion and reconstruction. Mm-hmm. I think these are utterly necessary in today's India and of course in today's United States. And here I may mention one or two things if you will allow me.
And Brother Gandhi, as you prepare to make, let me just make one note. And because of one of the questions you sent me, it's moral fusion where you refuse to give up on those deepest values, as our sister was talking about at the beginning. Because then you fight against these small puny language compartments like left and right and Republican and all that stuff. Because the moral spiritual values open up a whole different conversation, but also a whole different imagination.
So, and by fusion, I also mean solidarity, you know.
That's right.
So now, but I wanted to mention a couple of recent things about India. Last year, 2019, the present Indian government passed a law which profoundly troubled everybody in India. And this law was like this, that India has many neighboring countries. And the law said that if refugees from these neighboring countries come to India and they want citizenship of India at some point, their path to citizenship will be simplified, will be made easier, provided they are Hindus, or Sikhs, or Christians, or Jews, or Buddhists, but if they are Muslims, there will be no path to their citizenship. So for the first time, religion was introduced as a criterion of citizenship. And there was a very great movement all across India over. And in the end, through an amazing nonviolent movement, somewhat similar, this happened in December of last year and January and February of this year, that there were marches on the streets of India in many, many cities, like the marches we have seen this summer in the United States. And as a result of these marches, now this particular law still remains, but there were other corollaries of this law. There was an attempt to get every Muslim in every part of India to somehow prove again that his or her father or grandfather was an Indian citizen. But this particular move, that there should be a new kind of population register, and every Muslim particularly would have to prove his or her citizenship, that move had to be abandoned, at least for the time being, thanks to this amazing non-violent protest all across India. But as a result of this defeat that this Hindu nationalist government faced as a result of this defeat, they have now launched reprisals. Mm-hmm. And they're arresting those who organize these peaceful protests. And they are framing false charges against them, mm-hmm. accusing them falsely of instigating violence. And a large number of wonderful people I personally know in some cases, have been booked, have been named as possible organizers of violence. Mm-hmm. So this is also a reality in today's India, which I want people like yourself and others to be aware of.
And it's extraordinarily dangerous. As I mentioned, what happened in this country when religion started splitting itself and said, we're not going to follow our tenets of love, we're going to follow the tenets of authoritarianism and racism and nationalism. And then when you add to the mix of that, people basically saying, these people who are part of this particular religious faith, who are on this earth, i.e. are not welcome into our humanity, into our space. And that's what you just said to me is why we have to make sure, whether it's we clone or whether we wait till COVID and go, or whether we do some of this like we're doing it today, longer than we have today, it's because I'm thinking about how that same reality is beginning to happen even more here. We have to deal with it wherever it happens, because it is quite dangerous in the name of religion, in the name of believing in the one God, a God or a spirit or a divine that created everything, to then think you can take that away from God and start being God yourself. And in my scripture, in the text that I read, the greatest sin in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Bible of all things is idolatry, self-worship. And self-worship always plays itself out in a nasty, ugly nationalism when it's played out with the seats of power. That's idolatry. And then the second greatest sin is mistreatment of the poor. And so, and in the scriptures that I read, wherever you have the idolatry, you have the mistreatment of the poor. And whether you have the mistreatment of the poorest, you can trace it right back to somebody having been taught religiously that their mistreatment is actually holy, that their wrong is actually holy. Now, in our country today, we are seeing a lot of this with this so-called notion. It's been around a long time. And, you know, we had slaveholder religion early in this democracy. And they claimed it was Christianity, but it wasn't. It was slaveholder religion, which is why Frederick Douglass said, I love the religion of Jesus, but I'll have to hate the religion of the slaveholder. And then after slaveholder religion, in the 1930s, 40s, there was a form of religiosity that was designed to challenge Franklin Delano Roosevelt and to challenge the Social Security, and claimed that it was socialism, and that if you helped poor people up, it was actually violating God's mandate for them to get up by themselves. But then you have now today in our country that is this white nationalism that tries to perpetrate itself as Christianity or conservative Christianity. That's why I don't like these little causes. But at the end of the day, when you ask them and you look at what they support, and you say, well, Jesus or a God of Moses, in my tradition, supported love and justice and help for everybody. And you ask them, what do you support? And they say, well, we support being against women, right? The Jews, we support not having prayer in the schools. We support guns. We support keeping immigrants out and building walls. And there's this attempt now, even I was listening to the Attorney General today, bragging about the very Attorney General who's been right at the front of putting up walls and creating modern day concentration camps for our Latinx brothers and sisters to go in where they're dying and whatnot. And now we find out today that they had planned to use possibly heat rays on the protesters in DC. This was announced, where they were going to burn their skin. They had actually brought that stuff closer, and they had stockpiled all this ammunition. And he's talking about all this comes out at the very time he says, I'm a conservative Christian. But when you unpack what that means, he really, really should be saying, I'm a religious nationalist.
Yes.
And my faith is my racism. My faith is my authoritarianism. In fact, not only is my faith, it is the essence, it is my God. And once we turn to making division, denial, and depriving other people of their rightful place as human beings, regardless of their race, their creed, their color, their sexuality, we have stepped over into a place of idolatry and self-worship. We've actually put ourselves almost in the place of God. And that is why in those very moments, it is the requirement, the faith requirement of those of us who know better and who know love and who know just, and can talk and can challenge those that are doing that without hating them. But understand that they've been captivated by, if you will, the spirit of authoritarianism. They've been, and that many times they're operating out of deep fear. A lot of what we see in these Indian or American is those that have held power. I believe in my heart, Brother Gandhi, a lot of it is as the nations grow and as the people grow and as the demographics grow, the people who have kept the power, took the power, stole the power, held the power, benefited from the power, and done all kinds of things to people to do it, have a fear that the people that now are coming up are going to do the same thing to them that they did to us. And that's not our intention. It never has been our intention. Our intention was simply this: full humanity, full citizenship, justice, love, and truth. And it becomes our obligation. Nonviolence is more needed now. What your grandfather taught, what Howard Thurman embraced, what he had learned from the bowels of those who fought against slavery and then after slavery, what Dr. King is more necessary now in this place where not only do we have all of this religious nationalism that's playing with the hearts and minds of people, turning them in on themselves, creating what I call the very spirit and demonism of injustice. But when you have that along with the weaponry
yes,
that exists in the world,
yes, my God,
it is our time. This has to be. I said the other day to somebody, whether you're in India, I didn't say it, but I apply it now, whether you're in India or in America, I believe there are 5 interlocking injustices that are facing. Systemic racism, and it plays itself out maybe one way in India, one way here, but it's still systemic racism, right? Systemic poverty, ecological devastation and denial of basic health care to people of the world, the war economy, where the economy of war drives so many decisions, and then the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Those 5 interlocking injustices threaten the very soul and heart of the world, and I believe can only be challenged by movements that are rooted in deep love, deep justice, deep humanity, and movements that are willing never to choose killing to stop killing, even if it costs you. I mean, there's a group of us, Dr. Gandhi, that have said in these days, we have a lot of people, and the caste system, the residue of caste has a lot of a lot of ways it shows itself. We're seeing it in the midst of COVID. A lot of people are dying today in COVID because of how they were born.
Yes.
They were born poor.
Yes.
And COVID kills more poor people. They were born Black, and because they were born Black, many of them in areas where they have less access to health care. And so we're seeing death that comes out of people's birth. Now, in that place, a few of us were talking the other day and said, what do you do when you live in a world where the reality comes, where it becomes reality that in 48 hours, any of us could be dead? COVID has created that. In 48 hours, any of us could be on a breathing machine. I have one family that has lost 12 members since March in different places in the country, 12 members. I've been on the bedside of others. So we thought deeply about that for about 2 weeks. And we said, you know, the reality is every day, all of us live about 12 minutes close to death. Because if you stop breathing, most of us for 5 minutes, then that's a long time. And a few others, if you didn't breathe, it's over. So maybe in this moment, like your grandfather chose to, like Dr. King and others chose, we must decide there is something greater than length of life. What is most important is how we live, and not how we live unto ourselves, but how we live out the values of love and justice and nonviolence in the world. And so maybe we need to make a pledge that says, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to live the rest of my life like I might have only 48 hours of breath left. 48 hours before I have to say I can't breathe. And then I'm going to look at what is most important for me to use my breath doing. What's most important? Since I only have 48 hours at any time, that's a possibility, then I can't be wasting breath. I can't waste breath destroying people. I can't waste breath being quiet when I ought to be speaking up. I can't waste breath hating. I can't waste breath trying to kill people. I can't waste breath on religious nationalism. I can't waste it because I only got this 48-hour period possibly. And it's real clear now. And so what we're going to do is decide we're going to live like that, whether we live 48 more years or 48 more days or 48 more months. We're going to wake up every morning and say, I might on, and the old folk and the slaves and the civil rights movement, they used to sing this. This might be my last time. This might be my last time, children. This might be my last time. Might be my last time. I don't know. Then they would say, so I'm going to fight on until my last time. Fight on until my last time, children. Fight on until my last time. It might be my last time. I don't know. And in our countries, those who are the remnant, we are both the remnant and the salvation of these two democracies. Didn't ask for it, didn't ask for the mantle, but those in India who know nonviolence and no truth and no justice, those in this country, we in this moment are being called not just to live, but to live out our deepest and most profound moral visions. And I'm not sure that we'll change it all. I'm not even sure if the countries of the power structure will listen immediately. But there's one more scripture in my biblical, my text that it says, do it, and at least they will know there hath been a prophet among them. Our witness, and you know the root word in Greek for witness is martyr.
Martyr.
We have to be a martyr to our own. There's a lot of things I would like to be doing, you know. Just fun, just wasting time, wasting breath. But when I hear what you say about India, and I see what's happening in America, and I see that this country is about to be the first major liberal democracy in the Western world where the former slaves will be in the majority,
Yeah,
See,
yeah.
that's freaking out authoritarianism all over the world.
Yes.
All over the world. So people are trying to grab everything they can right now. I mean, what would that look like if the former slaves and brown people then make up the majority in a Western democracy with the kind of influence and power that it had? I mean, that's another question. But the point is, in this moment, breath is a commodity, not just for living, but for living out and embracing and breathing into the democracy of India that's struggling, and breathing into this democracy of America that's going through a third reconstruction life, the life of love, justice, and truth.
So this is very stirring, very profound. But I want to offer just one or two thoughts, if I may. When India, under Gandhi's leadership, fought for independence from British rule, the Indians were the vast majority. British who were in India were a small minority. Yes, the British had the big guns and they had soldiers and tanks. But on India's streets, the white man was a minority. Whereas when the African Americans were fighting for their rights, their freedom, the whites were a majority.
Right.
So in many ways, the struggle of the African Americans for justice and equality in the United States, in many ways was tougher, more difficult than the fight in India. Although in India too, to fight this great power with all its airplanes, and tanks, and guns and cannons was a tough fight. Yours was a tougher fight. I wanted you to know that people like me are aware of this. But I also am aware of another fact, and you alluded to it just now. In the world today, countries like India have an immense population, 1.4 billion. And there's China, and there's Africa, and Africa is growing in a much greater, with a greater speed than the rest of the world.
That's right.
So before long, the whites of Europe, the whites of the United States, of Canada, Australia, will be a small minority in the world. And you, and people like you, and people like me, and others who are colored, we are the majority in the world today. And so what we will give to the world, we will give to ourselves and give to the world, is also going to be very, very important. So the thoughts you've expressed are of tremendous relevance and importance.
And you know, it's going to be a tremendous responsibility.
Yes, yes.
You know, really, in the real sense, Brother Gandhi, to be the majority, we already are.
Yes.
In terms of population, but then to be in the majority in terms of also voting and political power.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why authoritarians are hooking up now. And countries with authoritarian nature, or when you mess around and elect a president like Trump, who has all of this authoritarian tendencies, then starts feeding authoritarians and supporting authoritarians in other countries, right? Because it's in a sense that if it's not going to be all quote unquote white, we want to make sure the power is at least in the hands of people who may not have the same color, but have the same mindset, have the same consciousness about other humanity.
Absolutely.
And yet here we are, and we will, and we're being handed in the real sense the world, right? The demographics are shifting, and that's not going to stop. And I think it's important for us to early on in this process to be very conscious about the kind of world. That's why one of the things, the Poor People's Campaign, we keep being very clear about what we are against, the interlocking injustice. We don't want people to have any mistake. We're not trying to destroy you. In some ways, we're trying to save you. You know, do you realize this country cannot ultimately be what it ought to be if you got 50%, almost 60% of the people living in poverty and low wealth. I mean, that's just here in America. And then, as you said, in India, you're talking about 3 times more than the population, almost 3 times more than the population of the United States.
Yes.
We're trying to show people that injustice, caste systems, injustice systems rooted in hate, invariably have their own destruction already woven in it. You just can't hold it but so long. And ultimately, it's going to implode. It's going to fall in on itself. I mean, history has shown us that. If it wasn't so, all of the great nationalist, authoritarian governments of ancient would still be existing. But all of them imploded. All of them, right? Took a lot of pain, a lot of people, but they all eventually failed.
And today's authoritarian systems will also, before long, go away. We don't know how this length of time is going to be measured and how long will be. But I absolutely share your conviction that this too will go away. But meanwhile, the witnessing, the willingness to be martyrs, as you have mentioned, and indeed so many courageous young men, young women, not only in India, not only in the US, but in many other parts of the world, are fighting for these universal principles of a common humanity, of inclusiveness. And just as there is white nationalism here, there is Hindu nationalism in India, there is Muslim nationalism elsewhere, there is different kind of nationalisms in different parts of the world. And I think your description of nationalism as some kind of self-worship is a fantastic description of that kind of idolatry, the modern idolatry.
I like what you just said too. I use that word sometime. I didn't use it today, but it's a concept that I hope you all will take up in your conference. What do you do in the meanwhile?
Wonderful, wonderful, tremendous. Meanwhile, yes.
That's the question. The question is not what do you do after a while. The question is what do you do in the meanwhile? The question is not what do you do in the future time. The question is what do you do in the meantime? The meantime is what's going to determine who you are, what your character is, what witness you leave, and it's going to have some impact on how long the mean times last.
Yes, that's absolutely fantastic. So I hope, Reverend Barber, that we will continue this and that we will find ways in which people of Indian origin, Indian Americans, other Asian Americans, African Americans, and white Americans, and everybody will fight on the basis of what you have outlined. And
you know, one of the models in the Poor People's Campaign, and my dear sister knows it now as I close, I did several books, but one of the books that I'm most proud of is one I never intended on writing. And actually it was a sermon I preached one morning at the St. John Divine Episcopal Church in New York. And I was struggling with preaching that morning. I was there, Dr. King had preached in that pulpit. And I found myself rooted in 3 passages of scripture. One is Psalm 118, the stone that the builders reject have now become the chief cornerstone. And this is the day the Lord hath made. And the reference, since the psalmist is there, is that the rejected people end up becoming the cornerstone for a new possibility in a new world. And when you see that happening, you are seeing the very hand of God. That when you see the rejected becoming the cornerstones of new reality for justice and love, you are actually seeing God's carpentry. You're seeing God's masonry. You are seeing God doing what only God can do. And that is take that the rest of the world threw away, said was untouchable, unusable, and go down in the quarry and make the very rejected thing, not just a stone in the building, but a chief cornerstone. And the image there is that a cornerstone is not in the corner of a building. In the ancient world, the cornerstone was in the middle of the building up high. It's what connected the building. And the chief cornerstone was placed in there. And as long as that stone was strong and right, all the other stones could be partially imperfect. But that stone had to be perfect. But then the text suggests that God takes what others have deemed imperfect by the rules of men and the politics of this world, and says the very thing you have thrown away is actually the only thing that can hold this building together. And I started talking about we are called to be a movement, that the only people that can lead the revival are the rejected. And over again in religious traditions, I'm sure there's stories in Hinduism and stories in Islam and Christianity, are these texts where the unexpected folk, you know, there's another one about the valley of dry bones, you know, that God says, I need somebody to stand in the gap. And the prophet says, well, can't find anybody. God says, go down in the dry bone where the people are in the valley. That's the hope of the nation right there. And they become the great hope, or in my Christian tradition, the day of Pentecost, where the Spirit gathers the very people that have been, whose leader has been destroyed by authoritarianism, has been destroyed by racist nationalism, has been crucified and killed as a troublemaker. And then something happens and the Spirit and the wind blows, and all of these rejected disciples become this powerful force, this satyagraha, if you will, grabs them. And it's not even named as such in the scripture. And so I was preaching this sermon that morning, and I talked about how we have too much of rejection in the world. And the next time I preach it, I'm going to broaden it, I promise you, beyond just America. But I laid out too much the rejection. And then I said, but you know, only the rejected can lead this revival. Then I started talking about how the rejected had done it down through history. It was all, in some ways, your grandfather was rejected, but he was a cornerstone. In some ways, Martin King, Howard Thurman were rejected, but they were cornerstones. And you go on and on. The people that marched with, finally followed your grandfather down to the sea to do the most powerful nonviolent thing in gathering salt. But who followed him? They were the rejected. And they ended up transferring. The people that marched in the civil rights movement, we know the heroes, but the people in the march.
Yes, yes, yes.
And truth of the matter is, even the heroes were among the rejected and the sheroes. And so I was preaching that sermon on that day, and I began to close with this piece that came to me. When we all get together, what a day of rejoicing it will be. And I started talking about how when the rejected get together, and the Spirit began to show me a vision of what's possible. And I closed that sermon in an Episcopal church. And I started to turn to go down, because this is like high church. This is like the bishop, you know, of the Episcopal church was there. While I'm a bishop, this is high church. This is anthem. This is pipe organ. This is, you do your 20 minutes and then you sit down. This is, you know. And I started walking down the steps, and something said, the people need to come to the altar. It was right after the inauguration of Trump. A lot of craziness was going on. And it said, the people need to come together, pray. And I said, I'm talking back to myself. They don't know it. The organ has already started playing the ending music. And so I said, okay. And I'm not saying someone audible was speaking to me, but I just could feel it. So I turned around and said, Bishop of the church, something is just leading me that we need to model being together. We need to embody, because there are a whole lot of people in this room this morning that came here with the feeling of being rejected. And all of us need to stand up and own the fact that God wants to use us to revive love and justice and be the cornerstone of a new society, a new reality. And people started getting up. Bishop got up, and they started grabbing hands. And this altar in this Gothic church fills up, almost like a Pentecostal church in the country. But now we're in this Gothic church, and we began to pray out about, we accept that we are not just rejected. We are the stones that the builders of nationalism, that the builders of injustice, that the builders of racism have rejected. But you haven't rejected us, God. And we accept our assignment now to not merely stay in the quarry being thrown away by humanity, but we accept our assignment to be the builders of a new world. And after the service was over, the pastor told me, that's only the second time in the history of this 100-plus-year-old church that there ever was an altar call. I did not know that. It was not planned. And out in the audience was a publisher. I did not know that. And about 6 months later, they came to me and said, we have done something. We've got the transcript. We want to put this book out called We Are Called to Be a Movement. And I'll send you a copy, because in the meantime, in the meanwhile, our singular assignment as those who have known rejected is to be the movement towards the better times, towards the love times, toward the justice time, toward the time without nationalism. We are called. It's not so much what the authoritarians are doing. We can't just use that as an excuse. I can't, you can't. We have an assignment. And that assignment is to move the world toward what your grandfather believed in, toward what he and Howard Thurman and others conversed about, toward what Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others believe. As I say to the young folk, you're not new. Don't be so smart. Don't be so arrogant to think you're the first ones that done this. You're not even the first ones that have come together black and white. It may be more on TV now, more people see it, but every moral movement has had diversity in this country and around the world.
Yes.
What you are is just, all you are is in your time. It's your time now. And what you have to hope that in your time, with all of this, the things at your disposal, you do it a little bit better than those that did it in their time. And you never forget, you stand upon those who did not give up in their meantime and in their meanwhile, and accepted the mantle of being a movement of revival for the nations.
So I will just say one thing, and then I hope you will conclude. Allow me to say one more thing. Of course, you know Mary McLeod Bethune.
Yes, yeah.
And towards the end of her life, she said something like this: the world has walked into my heart.
Mm.
And my plea to Reverend Barber, he has already accepted my plea, but I want to reinforce and repeat it. Please allow the suffering millions of India to enter your heart.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I will, with your help.
Yeah, that's all.
I want to be taught, and I want to bring folk together to be taught, because we cannot be apart. We have to be a part in this movement together. And I make my solemn commitment to that. Yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Take care now.
Thank you.
Peace and blessings.
Sunita, you might want to turn your microphone on.
Oh, sorry. Raj Mohanji?
Yes.
Raju. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was the most amazing conversation that I've ever heard in my life. And I think you helped re-energize all of us. And we have a lot of meanwhiles to address. And we are with you, and we look to your leadership.
No, but what a man Reverend Barber is. My God.
Yes.
My God, what a man. It's absolutely fantastic. And all of you who thought of this and made it possible. So there is so much richness there. It's absolutely fantastic. And so I feel very thankful to every single one of you, all of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
You
I
have
think
to take.
Sunita is the culprit here. She's been doggedly pursuing this.
Oh my God,
and we are,
so
we're
many emails.
thankful to her.
Not taking no for an answer. Raj Mohanji, take him to India.
Yes, I will.
This whatever we're in right now, when it passes,
Yes.
let's do that. And I mean, I don't know if they'll let us all in, but whoever can go.
But Sunita, you have to, I don't think this is a time to be talking about details, but obviously we need to take up his offer to be educated about India. We can perhaps have some sort of workshop or something with his staff, something that we can get started in terms of that. I don't know. It's a small thing. He's talking about bigger things, but that's the only thing I can think of.
Well, I have very good relationship with staff of Poor People's Campaign. So that can definitely be done. I don't know. I think I need to go and like jump around or something. I feel all this energy.
You should accept congratulations without any embarrassment. You are guilty, Raju said. But all of you share in this. And so we can rejoice. But my God, what a spirit, what a man, what a man. And you know, when you mentioned the witnesses and the martyrs, I was thinking of Umar Khalid and all these people who are now. And of course, dear Swami Agnivesh was recently left us. So, and as he said, absolutely that the victory is inevitable. You know, but meanwhile, we have much to do. Anyway, that's all from my side. Thank you, dear friends, very much.
So much. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Sunita, we can schedule a debriefing some other point. I think you just need to live the moment for now. Kapil and Giri, thank you.
Kapil Giri will help edit.
We did, Sunita and I did stay on with the video because barring that, we would have shown that group photo with Punya